A number of former Facebook employees spoke to Gizmodo about the fact that when they were curating the types of news that trend on Facebook, they tended to shy away from conservative-leaning sources and conservative-leaning topics. In fact, according to Gizmodo, one individual says that workers prevented stories about right-wing CPAC gatherings, Mitt Romney, Rand Paul, and other conservative topics from appearing in the highly influential section, again, the trending section, even though they were organically trending among the site's users. Now, understand that this sounds a lot worse than it really is once you get into the details, but it's still pretty bad because regardless of where you get your news, even if you're Googling certain things, a lot of times an algorithm caters to what the platform thinks that you want to consume, right? So if you're Googling something, oftentimes you'll get search results that align with your political ideology. So that shows that there's a certain bias or a certain bubble that you're in. You have a certain type of bubble when you're absorbing or consuming news on Facebook as well, because you have these so-called news curators deciding what is and is not trending, okay? So several former Facebook news curators were instructed to artificially inject selected stories into the trending news module, even if they weren't popular enough to warrant inclusion, or in some cases weren't even trending at all. Curators have access to a ranked list of trending topics surfaced by Facebook's algorithm, which prioritizes the stories that should be shown to Facebook users in the trending section. The curators write headlines and summaries of each topic and include links to news sites. Now, one thing that they do, it's not like, oh, here is a topic that involves conservatives, we want to censor it so no one ever sees it. That's not what they were doing. What they wanted to ensure is if there is a topic coming from a very clearly biased news source, like Newsmax or the Drudge Report, they would wait until the same story was reported by a more credible or neutral news organization before posting it in the trending topics.
Okay, so this is definitely nuanced. So let me tell you the parts I agree and disagree with them on. So if they did as one of these guys alleges, take a story that was trending about Ted Cruz and not put it in the trending section, that's unacceptable.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I wouldn't want them doing that to Bernie Sanders. I don't want them making those kind of editorial decisions that based on what candidates they like or don't like or find acceptable or unacceptable. And it's not Facebook as a company doing it. Mark Zuckerberg isn't up there and is, okay, let me figure out which articles. All right, that's not how it works. It is the news curators, and there are curators. Of course there are, right? And by the way, in newspapers there are editors. That's what they are, news curators, right?
Yes.
So that happens. But I don't want them doing that. I think that's the wrong thing. If you got a story that's trending on Ted Cruz, by all means, put it where it belongs in the trending section.
Let me just emphasize and clarify one thing, okay? This was not a company-wide policy. What this does, rather, is highlight the fact that individual biases do play a role in the types of news stories that get published on certain outlets, that get exposure on different platforms. In this case, as you mentioned, I want to reiterate, it's not like you had upper management or executives at Facebook talking to these news curators and telling them, hey, you know what, we need to censor conservative news. This has more to do with individual biases and how they play a role in the media.
So that's the one side. The other side of it is that, no, they're right to double check some of those sites. Now, that might negatively impact us, for example, and progressive sites. So they might have a pro-establishment bias, which I don't like, but I get why they do it. So here, let me explain. Now, I think the sites that are more progressive-leaning have shown over and over again that they are reliable. Now, I know that the other side will scream that that's not true, right? But look, we're very honest with the audience. We have a progressive perspective, right? But whenever it's a conservative site, we triple check. Why? They are notorious for making things up. And every time, I would say literally 50% of the time that we check a story from a Breitbart or a Newsmax, you find out that the facts don't match the story at all, right? Sometimes the fact pattern will match, and then they'll have their perspective on it, which we will find outrageous. But there's nothing wrong with that. Then you would run the story on the fact pattern, right? And then you can have whatever perspective you like. But if you're telling me they're double-checking Breitbart stories before they put them up, well, I think if you're a good editor, you have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah.
Even though that might mean that, hey, they're just going to call it even and go, oh, well, then I'm going to check all Huffington Post stories or Young Turk stories. Well, that sucks for us because we try really hard to make sure we've got it right.
Right.
Unlike those guys, but at least I understand the process by which they got to that decision.
Yeah, and look, I totally agree with you in that if they choose to really vet our content, I'm in favor of that because I know that what we report, aside from our opinions are our opinions. But when we're reporting the facts, we're doing just that. And if they want to vet that, that's totally fine with me. But what they're doing with these conservative outlets is similar to what I do, not only with conservative outlets, but outlets that maybe have a shaky history with their credibility. So for instance, every once in a while I'll come across a story from the Daily Mail, which is a publication in the UK. And they're known for doing some pretty bombastic pieces, really interesting stories that in some cases are tabloidy and not true. But let's say there's a story that really piques my interest and I decide I want to cover it on the show. I'll never just rely on the Daily Mail. What I'll do is I'll check to see if Reuters or the Associated Press, two very credible, pretty much unbiased outlets, whether or not they've covered the same story and what the facts are. That's okay. That type of curating is okay. But if you decide, hey, here is a story that our conservative readers would like, here's a story that gives some exposure to, conservative politicians, we're going to censor that. If that's what's happening, that's unacceptable. You can't do that.
So let me give even more context. So some publications on the right, National Review, whatever it might be, I don't have to double check as much. So I understand that those guys have real editors and they make an effort to make sure that they get things right. So, and obviously I think that's true of Huffington Post, Young Turks, etc., right? But there are some on the right and the left that you do have to double check because they have a history, a fact pattern of doing this for political reasons. So the Daily Caller is a pretty good example of that. And their stories don't check out often because they're political hatchet jobs. By the way, now anything that the David Brock and his group publishes, they bought a website just to do a hatchet job against Bernie Sanders, right? And they are purposely putting things out there, and they admit that they're coordinating with the Hillary Clinton campaign to put out $1 million worth of trolling on the internet. So now they're on the left. You want to double check those guys? Definitely. Because they're announcing to the world our job is to be political partisans and not necessarily wedded to the truth.
Yep.
You should definitely double check both of those.
Right.
So it's not right or left as much as it is the history of those particular websites.
That's exactly right. And I want to leave you guys with one final quote from one of these former news curators to kind of show you that, again, this is more about individual biases and how they play a role in the media, which is why it's important for you to diversify your sources. You should never rely on one news source, right? I mean, of course, I have a vested interest to tell you guys, hey, only watch the Young Turks. But no, don't only watch the Young Turks. Watch our content and fact check us. We want you to do that. We want you to go out and consume news from other outlets and figure out what your own ideology is. Now, here's one last comment that I think kind of explains to you what the real core issue is here. It was absolutely biased. We were doing it subjectively. It just depends on who the curator is and what time of the day it is. Every once in a while, a red state or conservative news source would have a story, but we would have to go and find the same story from a more neutral outlet that wasn't as biased. I think that last part is fine, but the fact that it really depends on who the curator is symbolic of what you experience in various newsrooms throughout the country.
So I'm going to actually add two things to that. One, the conservatives have huge victim complex, right? They do this all the time. Oh, war on Christmas! The country's against Christians. Hilarious, laughable, right? But they do it all the time. In this case, part of the reason I don't trust these guys, they say that they're conservatives, the guys who are the whistleblowers. I don't trust them completely. I'm concerned about what they're bringing up, and I would investigate it more, is that just like the IRS non-scandal, they're like, oh my God, the IRS is targeting conservative organizations. What they didn't tell you is the rest of the story, which is that it turns out they also targeted liberal organizations, and they actually targeted liberal organizations more. Oh, well, that's different. So this guy makes note of, it was a red state, Ted Cruz, no, they double-checked him. But he didn't make a list of all the liberal websites they double-checked.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. Yes.
So that's why this story is not as big as they're making it out to be.
Right, and the curator who spoke to Gizmodo was clear about his political affiliation. He identifies as a conservative, right? So if you have someone who identifies as a progressive or a liberal, they might have a different point of view in terms of the types of news that doesn't make it to the trending section.
And finally, the establishment bias is the one that you have to be most careful about. So the most understandable one is they're going to say, yeah, if the content was about Facebook, no, that had to go up to management,
yes.
right? And so I get it, but that's a reality, and you should be cognizant of that, right? And then also, if there certain topics were trending elsewhere, like on TV, like the Malaysian Airlines, in reality, it wasn't trending on Facebook, and that people overall are right. It wasn't that big a deal. It was an interesting story, but it wasn't that big a deal for as long as TV news covered it.
CNN covered it.
Right, but the establishment bias is they look at CNN, they're covering it 24/7, so they injected the Malaysian Airlines as trending into Facebook, which they shouldn't have done.
Here's a recipe for disaster and failure. Watching what CNN is doing and then just trying to mimic it on your platform.
The whole point of the internet is to do the opposite. To actually let the people vote and decide what's popular, and not executives at old media companies like CNN. Now, the Malaysian Airlines is a fairly benign one, but if they also take what CNN is doing in terms of hyping up war against Iran and other things like that, and they inject that into Facebook, boy, then that's a real problem, because that's the establishment bias that would be problematic. Whether you're right-wing, left-wing, it doesn't matter. But that's the propaganda we want to try to avoid by letting the people speak through what is trending.